No Man Has a Right to Own Mountains, Chapter 12. I've had a brilliant idea. Rosie looked across the bedroom. Connie sat on the side of her bed, with a triumphant look on her face, as she struggled to remove her leg. What is it? She finally got it off with a grunt and let it slip to the floor. It's Easter Eve on Thursday. We could go up to the pool and see if Coventina appears at midnight. We've already discussed this. The grown-ups won't let us. They don't have to know. But how can we get out of the house without them knowing? Simple. We borrow Ralph's tent tomorrow and pitch it in the old paddock. Then we'll camp out every night. So, you see, we won't have to leave the house to go up to the pool. But how do we persuade them to let us camp? We'll tell them your mother's taking you camping in the summer and you need to practice. I can't do that. It's not true. Rosie. Connie's tone indicated disappointment with her friend's seeming lack of spirit. Rosie laughed. It's Grandad that's promised to take me camping. You mean you'll do it? Yes, of course I will. Right. Last one to sleep brings me tea in bed in the morning. Sleep tight, Connie. Make sure the bugs don't bite. Thus the initial plans were made. Little did the two girls know what they were letting themselves in for. Other spirits were planning to be out and about that auspicious night, full of meaning as it was for practising pagans and Christians alike. It had proved surprisingly easy to persuade Ralph to allow them to use his tent. To cap it all, he'd volunteered his sleeping bag and insulated mat for their use, and then gone into Hayfield, bringing back another bag and mat he'd borrowed from a friend. Once they had him on side, persuading Connie's mother was an easy task. On the Tuesday night it started to rain heavily at 9:30, and Mrs. Gartside had hurried out to persuade them to spend the night indoors, but they'd assured her they'd be fine. Ralph's mountain tent was both wind and stormproof. We're as snug as a bug in a rug, Rosie assured her, and we have everything we need. On the Thursday evening there was a full moon and a clear sky. The air was sharp and the radio had forecast frost. They'd walked up to the pool earlier in the day and selected a spot where two great wind-sculpted boulders with another balanced on top formed a small shelter from which they had a good view of the pool, whilst remaining protected from any wind or rain if the weather forecast proved wrong. They were now walking away from the paddock, Connie armed with her walking stick, and Rosie carrying a torch, although she didn't believe they'd need to use it. Suddenly an owl hooted, somewhere from a tree behind the farmhouse. Rosie jumped and looked around, surprised by the unexpected sound. Tawny owl male, Connie informed her. Then an echoing cry from across the clough. Tawny owl female. It's that time of year when wild creatures are either begetting or begatting. Rosie laughed. Somewhere a dog barked as she adjusted the rucksack slung across her right shoulder. They listened for an answering call, but none came. Disappointed dog, Rosie decided. They continued towards their objective, the incline increasing the further they moved away from the farm. They were following a narrow sheep path, a distinct black ribbon against the rough grasses, which were beginning to turn a pale grey in the moonlight. The weather forecast seemed to be proving to be correct. Connie remained in the lead, and Rosie was quite happy to follow in her footsteps. She noticed how her companion swung her right leg in a slight outward curve as she brought it up off the ground to swing it forward for the next step, giving her a very slight rolling gait. Otherwise, she decided, nobody could possibly know it was a replacement lower limb. Then they heard somebody whistling, out of tune, followed by laughter and chattering voices. Doesn't sound travel at night, Connie remarked. That's people leaving the Sportsman. Rosie pushed up the left sleeve of her windproof. "It's almost 11:30 by my watch," she replied quietly. "Good, our timing's perfect," Connie said. She pointed with her stick without stopping. "There's the pool. If we follow the track to the left behind it and then scramble up there, we'll be home and dry. As long as the mermaid doesn't pull us down into the deep watery depths." Connie stopped in her tracks and turned towards her. Rosie caught the flash of green as the moonlight touched her friend's eyes. For a moment they looked just like a cat's, a wild cat. "Coventina is not a mermaid, Rosie. She's a water goddess. That's why she can grant immortality." Rosie smiled, but she couldn't help thinking Connie sounded serious, as though the distinction was somehow of importance. The younger girl turned away and continued upwards before she could respond to her statement. The sheep track disappeared, and the grass crackled sharply beneath their feet. The frost was coming fast. "Here we are," Connie announced. Rosie slung a bag off her shoulder. "Help me put this old blanket on the ground. We're going to need both." They soon settled in their snug hideaway, one blanket protecting them from the cold ground, and the other wrapped around their feet, legs, and up to their chins. "What time is it, Rosie?" 23 minutes to go." The pool lay immediately below them, about 30 feet away, a dark, shimmering patch against the grey background, its surface illuminated by the moon and rippled by a slight breeze. They remained sat next to each other, their arms cuddling their knees, their sides meeting and their blanket clutched around them for warmth. It was becoming far colder than they'd expected. Connie pulled a woolly hat downwards over her forehead and the back of her head. "What time is it now?" 15 minutes to go. Don't the farmhouse lights look bright?" "Yes, Dad should be home from the pub by now. Mum will be making his cocoa." Time was dragging, and Rosie became increasingly tense. The silence seemed overwhelming, and the whole atmosphere somewhat spooky. Connie seemed to sense her friend's anxiety, but it was Rosie who broke the silence. "Where did Ralph go?" "I've no idea. Shall I tell him you fancy him tomorrow?" "Don't you dare," Connie gasped. The youngster laughed. "So you do fancy him?" "I never said that. You said he was a lovely boy. In fact, you said it twice." "I just meant—" "Well, go on. What did you just mean?" Before Rosie could answer her annoying little friend, a man's voice floated upwards. "Do you have to do that? Shut up, I need a fag." "Well, we don't need everybody knowing we're up here. Lighting a fag, sending a signal for miles." The girl stared into the dark, trying to discover where the voices came from. "There they are," Connie whispered, pointing downhill to her left. "They're coming up here. They'll ruin everything." Rosie strained her eyes and followed Connie's pointing finger, but it was all in vain. She could see no sign of human beings. Then a flash of fire as the smoker lit his cigarette. "Who can they be?" "Keep your voice down, Rosie. I don't know who they are, but I do know we have to get rid of them." "How on earth can we do that?" "How good are you at imitating a mermaid?" "No, Connie, don't do it." Too late. The stone was already on its way, speeding through the cold night air to its intended target. Both men stood to the left of the pool, staring upwards and away from it, as if trying to work out the best way to get to whatever their objective was. They turned, startled by the loud, echoing plop, as the stone landed exactly where Connie wanted it to go. Ripples disturbed the centre of the pool, widening out in a growing circle of ruffled water. The thrower drew breath and began to open her mouth, intending to scream like a banshee and put the fear of the goddess up the men. But as she began to do so, one of them pointed across to the far side of the water. The alarm in his voice was clear and distinct. "Jesus wept! It's the mermaid!" Simultaneously they both took flight, running down the hillside as if the hounds of hell were on their heels. The two girls looked at each other in disbelief. Events were moving faster and far more dramatically than they could possibly have envisaged. Then Rosie was on her feet, thrusting the blankets aside, panic in her voice. "Come on, we've got to get out of here." Connie stood up but didn't move, rooted to the spot in amazement at the sight her eyes were revealing to her confused brain. Seconds later, she pulled herself together, a broad smile illuminating her face. "No, it's all right, don't." Rosie was already yards away and running fast as if trying to outpace the men. "Rosie, it's all right, it's Coventina. She won't hurt us. She has the old woman and the parson with her. Come back." Her friend was still running and continued to do so. Connie looked across the pool. The young woman in the long white robe remained standing on the rock, her hands uplifted to the moon, her golden hair streaming down her back. An older woman and a man stood on the rough tussock grass either side of her. Both were looking upwards, and both were dressed in similar white robes. The young lass began to walk towards them, stick in hand, absolutely calm, as if this was a regular occurrence. Rosie suddenly felt guilty, ashamed she'd abandoned the girl who she regarded as her closest friend. She stopped and turned to see her walking around the near side of the pool, obviously intent on joining the mysterious, ghostly apparitions. "Connie! Connie! Don't go near! Don't!" The girl either ignored or simply didn't hear her. Rosie began to run back the way she'd come, continuing to shout. The wind rose in a sudden wailing gust, carrying the sound of her voice away from her and in the wrong direction. She tried to run faster, growing desperate and in great fear for her friend's safety. But the increasing steepness of the hillside was rapidly turning her legs to lead. She looked across and saw the younger apparition embracing Connie and enfolding her in the long white robe. At that point she tripped and fell full length. "Oh, Connie, poor darling Connie," she sighed in a frustrated torment of hopelessness and desperation.